Hi, second grade students. Today's story is from Knowledge 9, Lesson 6, The War Begins. Before I begin our story, I'm going to go over our vocabulary words. Our first vocabulary word for today's story is the word civilians. Repeat after me. Civilians. Civilians are people who are members of society and are not part of the military or police force. Our next vocabulary word is the word clash. Say clash. Clash means to collide in intense disagreement. Our last vocabulary word is the word flee. Say flee. Flee means to run away quickly from danger. A civil war is a war fought between people of the same nation. Usually in a civil war, two or more groups of citizens in a country believe in things so strongly they fight each other in order to get their way. The war that began with the Battle of Fort Sumter would later come to be known as the U.S. Civil War, or the War Between the States, and it was an awful bloody time in American history. After the Battle of Fort Sumter, both sides, the Union and the Confederacy, built up their armies as quickly as possible. Throughout the North, people wanted President Lincoln to do whatever he could to end the war quickly, and most people assumed that the war would end quickly. After all, the Union had more people, more factories, a larger army, and a powerful navy. The first true test between the armies of the North and the South came in July 1861 in the state of Virginia. Virginia is home to the city of Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy at the time of the Civil War. Virginia also touches Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. 3 months after the Battle of Fort Sumter, thousands of Union and Confederate soldiers met in Virginia for the first major battle of the U.S. Civil War. As president, Abraham Lincoln was commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army, also called the Union Army. He decided to try to end the war as quickly as possible by sending his army to destroy the Confederate Army in Virginia and capture the city of Richmond. So it was decided that a large Union Army would invade Virginia. The Union Army moved toward the town of Manassas, where there was a small river called Bull Run. The plan was for the Union Army to crush whatever army the Confederacy tried to put in its path and then march on and attack Richmond. The Union Army had 35,000 soldiers, which up to that day was the single most largest army ever assembled in America. The Union did not realize, however, that the Confederate Army, or the rebels as they were also called, had roughly the same number of soldiers in the area. A large Confederate force had marched within 25 miles of Washington, D.C. They set up camp at the town of Manassas and waited to see what the Union Army would do. That July, the Virginia summer heat was so hot it was sometimes hard to breathe. Union soldiers, many wearing heavy wool clothing, marched slowly for 2 days over rolling farmland and across shallow, muddy creeks. The Confederate soldiers waited for them at Manassas. By July 21st, it was clear that the armies were going to clash. The only question was, who was going to fire the first shot? Many wealthy citizens from Washington, D.C., including members of Congress, traveled with the Union Army on its march from the capital. Like so many others, these civilians or non-soldiers expected a quick battle, a rousing victory for the Union, and a quick end to the Confederate cause. These civilians wanted to witness the Union's victory and the Confederacy's defeat in their own eyes. Now, imagine what it might have been like for these civilians who traveled from Washington, D.C. to Manassas to watch the battle. They had driven their carriages and packed nice picnic lunches. They brought telescopes so that they could see the action. Some even had brought their wives and children to watch history in the making. Imagine a family watching the battle unfold from atop a grassy hill. Civilians would watch from behind a line of Union artillery or cannons. As the Confederates marched across the field, the Union guns opened fire. Smoke filled the air so that the civilian observers could no longer see what was happening. They could not see the disaster that was unfolding right in front of them, but something they heard gave them an idea that this battle was not going to go as Lincoln and his generals had hoped. The Confederate Army did not run away as the Union had hoped. Instead, amid the firing of cannons and rifles, a new terrifying sound emerged. This sound would come to be known as the rebel yell, and it would haunt Union soldiers for years to come. It was a high-pitched scream, a battle cry, which the Confederates yelled out as they attacked the Union Army. Despite careful planning, almost nothing went according to the plans the Union Army had made. The Confederate cannons were older and less powerful than the Union cannons, but the Confederate soldiers firing them seemed to have more skill. Several of the Confederate commanders seemed to have more skill than the Union commanders as well. One commander named General Thomas Jackson showed particular courage and intelligence. That day, General Jackson earned the nickname Stonewall Jackson because he stood like a stone wall against the Union attack. Stonewall Jackson went on to earn a reputation as one of the most brilliant generals in the Confederate Army, although he was killed halfway through the war. This painting here shows him on his horse at the Battle of Manassas. Stonewall Jackson and the rest of the Confederate Army won the First Battle of Manassas. By late afternoon, the Union Army broke apart and retreated or went back toward the safety of Washington, D.C. The civilians who had come to watch the battle were shocked to realize that they were in the path of the retreating Union Army. The road back to Washington, D.C. quickly became clogged as the soldiers, running in on horseback, ran into panicked civilians trying to flee in their carriages. Thousands of Union and Confederate soldiers were wounded or captured in this battle. Hundreds of men on both sides died as a result of those wounds because doctors didn't have the equipment or training then that they have today. The landscape around the battlefield was also devastated or destroyed, with roads, bridges, and entire hillsides in ruins. This image here shows the destruction caused by the battle to both people and the land. A few days before, this was all lush green farmland. This was just the first of many, many battles in the years that the Civil War took place, and the battles would be much bloodier in the months and years to come. After that first battle, which was called the First Battle of Manassas or the First Battle of Bull Run, President Lincoln and others in the North realized that the Civil War would not be easily won. The Union realized that they would need a much larger army, and more importantly, they would need to prepare for a much longer war. In fact, within a year, many people would be wondering whether the Union would be able to win the war at all.